Port Adelaide set an ominous tone against the Saints. While for St Kilda, is it struggle street for 2025? But from a fantasy footy perspective, the scoring and the opportunities that both teams presented for us was absolutely phenomenal. Some locks, some watches, maybe even a fade. What were the things we learnt from watching this community series match of Port Adelaide taking on St Kilda? In short, there's a lot to dissect. It's MJ from the Coaches Panel. I do hope you're enjoying this series as we look through every single game of the community series, unpack what we should take away from these games, not getting lost in the fantasy and SuperCoach numbers, but looking underneath the surface to make sure we're not getting tricked or trapped into moves as we get ever so close to round one. There's a whole heap of guys that aren't playing in this game that we do need to put on the table. It's some guys getting greater opportunities. And with both of these teams not playing in opening round, it is important to factor these players in and remember who is not a chance to play in the first round and who might, because we could see some diverging away from structure, strategy, players in roles, and ultimately SuperCoach and AFL fantasy scoring. The Saints, they're missing a fair few of their best 22. No Rowan Marshall, no Jack Sinclair, no Max King. Mitch Owens out pretty early with a shoulder injury, so we could probably factor that one in. And some may say, I think I mentioned Jack Sinclair. If not, I'm doubling down and mentioning him. Some may say Jimmy Webster's best 22. I think he's fringe at best, but we'll put him in there. Then from a Port Adelaide perspective, the most notable is no Zach Butters, and then a Ryan Burton who does seem to be a little bit touch and go when it comes to the spot. Let's talk about St Kilda right out of the gate. You've got to lead it off with Jack Macrae alongside his fellow Jack in Jack Steele. He was the leader when it comes to centre bounce presence, and this politely was exactly the type of role that was forecast and exactly the type of positioning and scoring dynamic that we expected. A heavy split between uncontested and contested possessions, not really, much more favourable through to his work rate in transition. He was the club equal leader for centre bounce presence, but look, 5 tackles shows that there's that defensive work rate that's there. Not as many marks as I probably would have expected, but to be fair, the Saints were thrashed in all components of this game. So if the game's a little bit more even in future, we'll see that. But look, over 30 possessions. We don't talk about them, but tons across the formats. Just politely, this is not a player to fade. I'm all for creating divergence and separation in your side, but Jack Macrae just isn't this player. We're in a line that has swollen up in options over the last couple of days for us, but his value, he's proven, he's in the role that we know he scores, and he doesn't have to be Mr. 105, 110, 120, which he has been historically. Something in the 90s is going to return significant value. If you're fading Macrae, friend, find another place to create separation. Jack Macrae is not that spot. Go and look for other opportunities. Nasiah Wanganeen-Millera has been a relatively popular D1 in the community as well, with people unsure about some roles at the top end, some early buys for some others. They're looking for some opportunities. And I think, especially early in this game where the Saints were really off in the first quarter, I thought they were okay as the game went on. But in the first quarter, Port just absolutely wiped the floor with them. Now, he was really their bright shining light. He was moving the ball well, doing it in an adventurous space, and more often than not, it was coming off. He was their primary and key ball mover. What became interesting as the game went on was he started to get moved around a little bit. We started to see him appear at stoppages in the forward line, which should be of no surprise to us. We'd heard that being talked about in the preseason, but with no Sinclair, I was intrigued to see whether they would really anchor him into that back line or not. There wasn't a whole heap of kick-ins to come in this game. Port were relatively intentionally brilliant in front of goal in comparison. So there's not a whole heap of data points that we can sit through there. And he did pick up some centre bounces as the game went on. He was the leading club kicking guy. Let's not make a mistake about it. But 5 is not exactly a chaotically large amount. So I think if you were bullish on Nasiah, you've seen enough to continue that with confidence. They were just terrible politely, St Kilda, they were just terrible in a bunch of different areas of the ground. I think we'll see a few people fade him, but politely, what are you looking for? Did he have the role? Yes. Did he have kick-ins? Yes. Was he being the primary ball mover? Yes. Like, these are the things you wanted to see from Rozee anyway. You should expect a better ball movement with a better ruck in the side in Rowan Marshall, should he be there round one, and Jack Sinclair is all-Australian calibre. So that will fix up a bunch of different pockets for them. But I think if you were bullish on Rozee pre this game, continue on. But he wouldn't have probably changed anybody's mind to make him be someone you jump to. We've seen players do that this week, haven't we? Where they were so good, so brilliant, not just from a scoring output, but in role, dynamic, how it all sits within the makeup of our fantasy and SuperCoach sides, that we just walk and fall into them. Rozee wasn't that. Bullish, yes, carry on. If he wasn't on the radar or in your structure right now, look, he didn't force change for you is probably the best way to look at it. Hugo Garcia, mid-forward, that has been getting some love in pockets of the community. The number 3 player for centre bounce attendances in this game. And his time on ground's relatively low compared to what he did in the game. 18 possessions, couple of marks, couple of tackles. Certainly got involved in trying to get the Saints interested in the scoreboard perspective. It was interesting that as they were experimenting through that second half, Rozee, Wangan and Miller went into the midfield. But to me, how much and where does Jack Sinclair play and when does he return? Feels like that's going to have a variation of impact on Hugo Garcia. If Garcia stays where he did in this game, which is third option in at centre bounce, that plum role at his price point across the formats is someone I want to bite and a share of, because, gee whiz, the role is great for him in there. Now, he'll probably slip down an option should Sinclair come in as a midfielder, or Sinclair force Rozee, Wangan and Miller in there. It does still feel like for the Saints, it's Jack Steele, Jack Macrae, and then to come in next. So I think Garcia should still absolutely be on your radar. I think the challenge for him in the pocket that he sits now is we've had a few cash cow forwards really emerge for us through this week. Alongside that, some other variables have landed where players like Rankin and Horne-Francis have really emerged to the point that coaches a week ago weren't even considering either in their starting squads, whereas now there could be recency bias regardless, but people considering both. Injuries around the Dogs midfield. They've seen Sanders' stocks jump up, let alone a Matt Kennedy. And so where Garcia, he may just be a victim of others rising rather than him doing anything wrong. He does have someone that I still want some bites and some shares on, but politely, if you've not been looking at Hugo Garcia, you're probably going to continue on. But the role was there, and I think that's what we should be looking for in these community series games. What was the role, not was the points. And I thought he looked quite good with ball in hand. Yes, there's always a sub-risk, all those factors, but politely, I'd probably be thinking guys like Boxall and Hall and these kind of guys should, whatever their best 22 makeup be against the Crows in round one, I think they're just as probable as anybody else. Toby Travalia, should talk about him relatively quickly. This is now 2 games in a row. He's only got late minutes in both games. So at best, he's going to start his AFL career with the green vest. Time to move on. I do like the look of him. I think he's adds some speed and some cleanness to this side that's got elements of that. I think he'll be the one that pops into that midfield in 3, 4, 5 years' time and really regenerates this midfield alongside Matthias Philippou once Jack Steele and Jack Macrae move on. But no, Toby Travalia, we love you. A great keeper stash, but not so relevant at the start of our classic sides. Harry Boyd, I thought he looked okay in this game. He really got smashed in and around the ruck contest. Like he offered something, but 18 hit-outs is not a massive amount. He was at 65% of their ruck contests. They don't really have a lot of options. Like Owens, before he went off, was getting some around-the-ground stuff. And then it was Isaac Keeler, who, again, may have just done enough as others keep falling out through injury, may have just done enough to sit in that space. But personally, I like Archer Reed. a little bit more as R3, not just because he's got dual position status, but I feel like he's clear best 22. Harry Boyd could very quickly, even if he's named round one, to protect Marshall in the re-emergence back into the AFL system and gameplay. I just think he's going to fade out really, really fast. So, yeah, he can score okay when he's the number one ruck, but Marshall's coming back. Reed, and you can check out the North and the Eagles review game for my full thoughts on him, but I just think that's the better play. I wouldn't talk anybody out of Boyd, but if I had a choice between one of the two, that's where I'd be going. Q Boxall, there's a lot of these lower price Saints that we do have to talk about. It does feel like we're going to get 3 or 4 bites of a St Kilda cherry at some point in our teams. I thought he was pretty impressive, kicked a couple of goals, did get a little bit of opportunity through the midfield and also spent some time forward. I wouldn't say at least one of those goals was more gifted to him, but that's footy and that's absolutely fine. If you're looking in the benchmark territories of, a Lucas Camporelli as your kind of near basement price M10, M11 in SuperCoach or utility and fantasy sort of option, I think he's a play. I do think his ceiling and scoring is a little limited. I do think he's also very vest smelly when the likes of Sinclair to come back into this side. But let's just look and wait and see how it all kind of looks. I think we'll have an option through there. Angus Hastie is probably the other. It was impressive, a little bit more attacking in the dynamic of the role he was used in terms of how they played with and around and through him, in contrast to a Hugh Boxall, who I know kicked 2 goals. But I just liked what Hastie gave us a little bit more in this game. If Webster and Sinclair do both come back in round one, he does feel like someone that even if he's best 22, he's going to get squeezed for options. But regardless, a stash on the bench, I don't mind. Angus Hastie as a stash on the bench. So, yes, there's a lot of Saints we've got to look at in this game. But to me, I think it's pretty clear who the ones we should and must have and the ones that are just, look, it's nice to have, but it's not a must-have. Let's talk about Port Adelaide, and we have to talk about Jason Horne-Francis as the number one Port player in this game. Yes, you could argue it's Rozee, but to me it's Horne-Francis because he's been much more divisive across the community. There's been a lot of conversation about he doesn't accumulate enough for the AFL fantasy community, he doesn't get enough easy ball, and so as a result, his scoring ceiling is a little bit clipped. The SuperCoach community saying, he's a great player, but the gap between the best and the worst of his scoring is still quite volatile. I think he should be well and truly on the radar of your starting squad. The departure of Zach Butters in that midfield for at least the first month of the year is very, very critical. And importantly, he's still, I think, the 4th option at midfield here. Like it was Butters was nowhere to be seen with him not in the team. So it's Rozee, it's Drew, it's Wines, and then it's Horne-Francis down at 64%, while the other guys are 68 and above. So I think this. He's got the fixture. He's improved in a couple of areas of his game, especially some of that fitness component. Now, it wasn't a high stoppage game either, and yet he still gets 30-plus possessions, and there's not a goal in there either. So maybe this is the ceiling moments of Horne-Francis. Some could be a little bit more seeing the other side and go, look, 30 touches, got a bunch of free kicks, and he still just cracked the fantasy and SuperCoach stunt. I will hear that argument, and I wouldn't devalidate it either. I think it's a fair perspective. But the eye test, if you're going just off that, gee whiz, Horne-Francis looked scary good. I do think it might be a question for coaches now. Can you run a Jackson Macrae type at F1? Absolutely you can. But Horne-Francis and also Rankin have presented themselves as valuable forces at F1 or even at F2 as a combination. So I think the way people treat Horne-Francis and Rankin will drastically shape the rest of their forward line, let alone anywhere else. Because then you got Bailey Smith, who we didn't see, but I'm very bullish on him playing, but we'll wait and see what opening round dishes up. Davidson has popped. Connor Stone, I think, has popped. Isaac Kako is a viable play for us. Then you've got Garcia, who I've already mentioned in this game. Caleb Daniel, and O'Reilly Sanders. Like, what is that, like 9 guys to fit in, 10 guys to fit in 8 spots? Someone's got to fall out or get faded. Is Horne-Francis the guy? Look, he looked brilliant, and I think you'll want him at some point in the year. Whether or not you fade him is interesting or not. All I'll say is this. Just be thinking through the variables. Don't get caught up on a fantasy score. Don't get caught up on how a player played against a pretty bruise-free game of football. People will knock St Kilda for their effort in this game, and I think that has an element of fairness about it. But we've seen a lot of teams go down with injuries in this game. St Kilda had one themselves. You can be forgiven that certain teams just dial it back a little bit. That's not to underplay what Horne-Francis delivered for us. Don't hear that. But it is just to say, man, he looked good. The absence of Butters, I think, will help. But I don't think it's enough to make him a must-have. Hard to fade, absolutely. Must-have, absolutely not. I think we've got enough options to make an informed decision about what we do with our forward line. Connor Rozee. Oh, my gosh, just floated everywhere. Had a license to roam, and there wasn't a space that he could go. There's a couple of thoughts I have about Connor Rozee and Port Adelaide in general. Number one, I think their restrictive nature is still very much in play. They were one of the hardest teams to score against last year. And as a result, that does 2 things. One, in AFL Fantasy, when you've got a team that's coming up against Port Adelaide, statistical probability says they're going to score beneath their average. What that also does in SuperCoach is because they're restricting the opportunity of scoring, other elements get kind of jacked up in the SuperCoach because it's got to reach that magical number. And so we can see, and I can forecast, especially a player like Connor Rozee, let alone other Port players, because they're so restrictive and because they're so ball dominant with what they do, I can see them getting the boost and the scaling up in SuperCoach that's favourable for them that we have seen over the last couple of years. I say that because from a pure football sense, Connor Rozee screams AFL Fantasy and Dream Team. Almost must pick. There was 2 stretches of games last year where he was a 110 midfielder in 2 stretches of 5 games. Go back and check out the episode on this channel of the 50 Most Relevant where we unpack Connor Rozee and what he's been for really the last 2 and a bit years in this midfield. For me, this is a no-brainer pick in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team. I just can't fade against him, his early role, now the absence of Butters, and what he is when he's fully fit, which is a knocking on the door of a 110 mid. So to me, of all the things that I could take out, if it was like 2 guys that I wasn't prepared to go against, it's Macrae and it's Rozee. Everything else you can take on, but those 2, very, very hard to do so. SuperCoach, I think it's a little bit more of a conversation there. While, yes, he scored great, remembering he had 39 possessions in this game, like a wild statistical number. And he had 7 marks and 7 tackles. Yes, he had a couple of frees against him, but that's footy when you're around the ball that much. I don't mind him as a starting squad option, but I wouldn't say he's forced himself into that space as much as others. For people, they'll be bullish, they'll lock it in, and I won't talk them out of it. For others, they'll have seen some others' performances this weekend and they'll want a share of it too, and I totally get that performance and desire. He's good. I think he's hard to fade in AFL Fantasy. I don't think it's a must or even a have to in SuperCoach. I think it's a consideration and you can fade. Just remember that early fixture for Port is, I want a piece of that in all my teams, and if it's not Rozee, it's got to be Horne-Francis. I don't think you can go into a season this year without one of those 2 in your starting squad, regardless of the format. Jordan Sweet has been a popular R2 option. A lot of people have now locked in Tom de Koning for understandable and obvious reasons with no Mark Pitternet early. But what they do at the other R spot, are they going up to an English? They're going up to a Cherry? They're going up to a Gorn? Or are they going down to a Sweet type? viable play. All I'll say is this, yeah, he had the role, which was fine. He did share the duties with Soldo, not that I'd be too concerned, but he was rucking against a Sandful, and a very, very good Sandful ruckman in Harry Boyd. Harry may one day make it as an AFL ruckman. I think he's perfectly fine, but this is a guy this is his first, if not second, match simulation or practice game where he's up against AFL caliber ruckman. So Sweet should have dominated and did. That's no shade on Boyd. I think it's just putting it into consideration around the opponents he has. Go and do your ruck structure and ruck matchups over the first month of the year. Go and see if Sweets is favourable or not. And certainly if round one, it's a role share between Soldo and Sweet, you can't go there anyway. I think he does have the number one spot stitched up. I do not think they go dual ruck. I probably like some others elsewhere, but we'll see how we go. I want to lump a bunch of these next guys in the mix of the Port Adelaide defenders. Not one specific, but Farrell, Bergman, and Evans. I think all of these guys are probably pretty similar to how we spoke about the Gold Coast rebounders of Powell, of Noble, of Rioli. I probably want a slice of one of these guys in my draft side because I feel like at one given week, one of them will pop. All preseason, one of the big question marks has been who inherits and benefits from the departure of a Dan Houston. And my clear answer off the back of this game, and from what I've seen through the preseason prior to and heard, was that this role was not going to be inherited by any one person, but rather sharing of opportunity of the ball around a common 3 or 4 players. And I think with Farrell, with Bergman, and with Evans, they've all done enough for you to be interested in draft. In a salary cap format or classic, I don't want a piece of it. That volatility of scoring, of how the ball might not sit their way, is something that I'm not too interested, but I do want a share of one of these Port Adelaide distributors on my draft side. Whether or not it ends up on field depends on the shape up of how my side lands on draft day, but I do want a slice of it. Now, remembering St Kilda's forward line is relatively of lower quality compared to others, especially with no King and no Mitch Owens. They've left Menbury out of the side. He's now at Collingwood. So they are lacking in quality through there. So they were able to march it out of that forward 50 with relative ease. So I will put that as the disclaimer. But I think Farrell, Bergman, Evans, classic, no. Draft, yeah, I'm interested. Last 2 players I want to talk about in this game. Gosh, this might have been the longest match review we've done. I told you there were some relevant moves. Joe Berry, I thought he was okay in this game. I think he's best 22. But I think with some others popping up, he's probably sliding down our necessity as a bench forward. I think he's got good job security. I think with the early fixture, you can pop some 50s and 60s for us at his ceiling. But he's going to need to do that a couple of weeks in a row to really get that price movement going. So, look, probably a pass and a fade for me now, not because he's done anything wrong, but rather I just think others have elevated themselves in the line. And then one player I was pretty certain I would not be talking about at all during these community series. It was Jeremy Finlayson. He was really good in this game. They were lacking some of their depth of tools in the back line. He comes straight in. No Zerk Thatcher, throw in Finlayson. He's been a bit of their utility now over a number of years. Recruited as a forward, then spent a couple of games over the last few years, the number one ruck, and now sitting in that back line. From a classic perspective, here's what I'll say. I'd rather trade into Jeremy than start with Jeremy. It feels like a guy could get burnt real fast, real quick. And with the other options that have popped and emerged through the forward lines and established themselves, to me, I'd much rather stay in that space and trade into Finlayson as my parachute should one of these mid-range or premium forwards that I'm looking at not deliver what I expect. Finlayson is there because, look, he's just a little bit of an all-gap filling player. Really good at that. But what does this team look like and what does this role look like once a Zerk Thatcher comes back into this side? How does it sit with Radaglia and Alir? And how do they actually structure this up with Burton in this side? There's still a bunch of names out of this team, some short, some medium term. But I just want to see how that sits a little bit more. He is one of the better ball movers, and he did look good with some of his field kicking. But this is the kind of move that fantasy coaches that see the score and super coaches that see the score jump on, get it. And I feel like this could be a mirage for us. Yes, move him up your draft board a little bit. If you've already completed your draft, he's probably worth jumping into the player pool and going and grabbing and seeing. But this is the kind of guy that I feel like we could fall out of love if we're Port Adelaide very, very quickly. So to me, not really jumping at it just yet. Remembering the caliber of the opposition and how ease of ball movement this was for them, they just had the ball on the string, and St Kilda were very much in first gear. They weren't great either in first gear, but they were very much in first gear. So to me, I would just temper any heightened excitement about what this could be. Draft, yeah, sure. Late, yes, if it's completed. Classic, trade into, not start with, would be my advice. But do you agree or disagree with my take about this matchup between Port Adelaide and St Kilda? If you're watching this video on YouTube, comment below. Let me know which of the Power and Saints are currently sitting in your fantasy football sides. If you haven't subscribed to the channel and turned notifications on, it takes 2 seconds, but it means every single time we drop an episode here at the Coaches Panel, you get notified straight away. The audio podcast has been absolutely dominating for years, and we are so proud of the work that it's been doing in the community and your support of it. But if you haven't subscribed to the channel and given it 5 stars, it's one of the simplest things you can do that can support the Coaches Panel is subscribe and give us a 5-star rating and like these episodes as well. It's a small thing you do, but actually makes a huge impact for us at the Coaches Panel. So if you've never done that, could you do that today? We'd so greatly appreciate it. Inside the description of this episode is where you can get in touch with us across social media and join the conversation with the community. Get your hands on some Coaches Panel merch before the season starts, and you can become a Patreon, whether it's a breakout, a premium, or at that cash cow tier. There is a tier that is right for you. Not only do you support the Coaches Panel, but you get an extra bit of bonus content. And inside the breakout and premium tiers, you also get our draft rankings for free. So you can go and get that, or you can join the Patreon, check on the page, and if you're like, nah, don't want to be a Patreon, just want the draft rankings, go in there, click them, get them. You've got my draft rankings for what I would be doing on the Keeper platform in 2025 if you're drafting over there for a single season. Hey, thanks so much for tuning in. We'll be back again with another one of our Community Series match reviews.